The first thing Eleanor Hargrove noticed about Copper Creek wasn't the dusty main street or the imposing mountains that framed the horizon. It was the silence. After 3 days of rattling train cars and 2 more in a bouncing stagecoach, the sudden absence of noise felt almost unnatural. She stood alone at the station platform, her single trunk beside her, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across weathered boards. The stagecoach that had delivered her was already disappearing down the street, wheels kicking up plumes of golden dust that hung suspended in the still air like abandoned hopes. Eleanor smoothed her travel-worn dress, painfully aware of how the plain grey fabric hung from her thin frame. The journey west had stolen what little flesh she'd managed to put on before leaving Boston. 3 weeks of irregular meals and fitful sleep had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the circles beneath her eyes. She looked, she knew, like a strong wind might carry her away, hardly the robust farmer's wife Samuel Hollister had been expecting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her fingers found the letter in her pocket, its creases so deeply worn it threatened to disintegrate. Samuel Hollister, widower, seeking bride of good character and sturdy constitution to help maintain household and assist with farm duties. Must be God-fearing, frugal, and capable with children. She had responded immediately, enclosing a carefully posed photograph that hid her thinness through strategic draping and shadows. His reply had been prompt, practical, and now utterly meaningless. Miss Hargrove. Eleanor turned to find a woman watching her from the station doorway. Middle-aged, with greying brown hair tucked beneath a sensible bonnet, she wore the weary expression of someone who had witnessed too many human dramas unfold in this very spot. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, summoning what dignity she could. "I'm Martha Prescott, station manager's wife." The woman approached, sympathy and curiosity mingling in her gaze. "Samuel asked me to meet you. Said to tell you he's sorry, but there's been a change of circumstance." The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the rejection. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced her chin up. She had not traveled 2,000 miles to dissolve into tears on a dusty platform. "I see. And what precisely are these changed circumstances?" Martha hesitated, discomfort evident in her fidgeting hands. "Well, that is, when he saw—" "Oh dear." She took a breath. "He said you weren't what he was expecting. Not substantial enough for farm life," were his words. The brutal assessment hit Eleanor like a physical blow, though it wasn't anything she hadn't heard before. Too thin, too frail. A winter breeze could snap her in half, the familiar litany that had followed her since childhood. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the panic fluttering in her chest. "And might I ask what arrangements Mr. Hollister has made for my return journey?" Martha's expression shifted from discomfort to alarm. "Return? Oh my! He didn't say anything about— That is, I don't believe he considered—" Of course he hadn't. Why should Samuel Hollister concern himself with a rejected bride's fate? Eleanor's, and tightened around her small beaded purse, mentally counting the meager dollars inside. Perhaps enough for a night's lodging, but certainly not for a return ticket to Boston, a city that held nothing for her anyway. "I see," she said again, the words hollow. "Is there an establishment in town where I might find temporary lodging while I reconsider my options?" Martha's face softened. "The Copper Creek Inn takes boarders, though Widow Fletcher's rates might be more suitable for a lady in your situation." She glanced at Eleanor's trunk, clearly wondering what resources such a small container might hold. "I'd offer our spare room, but with my sister visiting and the children—" "You're very kind, but I wouldn't dream of imposing," Eleanor managed, a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "If you would direct me to Widow Fletcher's, I would be most grateful." As Martha provided directions, Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. Her teaching credentials wouldn't transfer to a frontier town without proper endorsement. Domestic service was an option, though positions in good households were likely scarce in a place this size. What remained were the choices no gentlewoman would consider unless truly desperate, and Eleanor wasn't quite there. Yet, one last thing, Martha added, her voice lowered, though no one was near enough to overhear. Samuel's already arranging to send for another bride, from Minnesota this time. Asked for someone, well, she gestured vaguely, sturdier. Eleanor absorbed this final humiliation with rigid dignity. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Prescott. I wish Mr. Hollister success in his search. The station manager's wife looked as if she might say more, but instead merely signaled to a boy lounging nearby. Jimmy will carry your trunk to Widow Fletcher's. It's not charity, she added quickly, noting Eleanor's expression. Station services included in your ticket. As Jimmy hoisted her trunk with surprising ease, Eleanor took a last look at the station platform where her dreams of security had crumbled upon arrival. The setting sun burnished the weathered boards with false warmth, a golden hue that couldn't penetrate the chill settling in her bones. Somewhere in this town, she would have to forge a new path, one that required neither Samuel Hollister's approval nor anyone else's assessment of her worth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Widow Fletcher's boarding house sat at the edge of Copper Creek's main thoroughfare, a two-story clapboard structure whose peeling white paint suggested better days gone by. A hand-painted sign hung beside the door. Clean. Rooms, respectable rates, Christian values observed. Eleanor hesitated on the bottom step. Gathering courage before Jimmy's impatient shuffling finally propelled her forward. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a tiny woman with steel-grey hair and suspicious eyes. "You must be the Hollister bride," she said, her gaze traveling from Eleanor's face to her worn shoes and back again. "Martha sent word you'd need lodging." News traveled quickly in Copper Creek, it seemed. Eleanor straightened her spine. "Eleanor Hargrove, ma'am, and I find myself in need of accommodation for a short period while I make alternative arrangements." "Temporary is all I offer," Widow Fletcher replied, stepping aside to admit her. $2 weekly for room and board, meals at 6 and 12, no gentlemen callers, no spirits, no returning after 8 in the evening." The terms were fair, if strict. Eleanor nodded agreement, following the widow into a narrow hallway that smelled of beeswax and camphor. The interior was meticulously clean, the furnishings modest but well-maintained. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed a parlor where two elderly women sat embroidering by the failing light. "The other boarders," Widow Fletcher explained, noting her gaze. "Miss Abernathy teaches at the school. Mrs. Winters is our postmistress, both highly respectable." The emphasis carried clear warning. Such standards would be expected of Eleanor as well. The room she was shown to matched the rest of the house, small but immaculate, containing a narrow bed, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a straight-backed chair, and a hooks for hanging clothes. The single window overlooked a kitchen garden where herbs and vegetables grew in neat rows. "Breakfast at 6, the widow reminded her. "Church on Sundays is expected. The bishop calls on the first Tuesday monthly to check on his flock." When she had gone, Eleanor sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally overwhelming her composure. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks, dropping onto the worn grey fabric of her travelling dress. She had gambled everything on Samuel Hollister, sold her few possessions, resigned her assistant teaching position, used the last of her savings for the journey west. All for a man who had taken one look at her thin frame and decided she wasn't substantial enough. A soft knock interrupted her misery. Hastily wiping her eyes, Eleanor opened the door to find a girl of perhaps 16 standing there, a covered tray in her hands. "Grandma thought you might want something to eat," the girl said, offering the tray. "Being as you missed dinner and the journey's so tiring," the unexpected kindness nearly undid Eleanor's fragile composure. "That's very thoughtful. Please thank your grandmother for me." The girl, Hannah, as she soon introduced herself, set the tray on the small table by the window. Lifting the cloth revealed a bowl of stew, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, alongside a slice of brown bread and a cup of milk. "It's not fancy," Hannah apologized. "But Grandma says good food is medicine for the soul." Eleanor managed, a genuine smile. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She says Mr. Hollister is a fool," Hannah continued, apparently untroubled by discretion. "Says any man who judges a woman by her size instead of her character deserves to die alone." Her eyes widened as she realized what she'd divulged. "Oh, I wasn't supposed to mention that." Despite everything, Eleanor found herself laughing, a rusty sound, unpracticed after weeks of anxiety. "I believe I like your grandmother very much." After Hannah departed, Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each bite of the simple meal. As she did, she gazed out the window at Copper Creek's main street. Lamps were being lit in windows now, pinpricks of warmth against the gathering dusk. Men filtered into the saloon across the street, while women called children in for supper. Ordinary life, continuing, indifferent to her personal catastrophe. Tomorrow, she decided, she would walk the town and assess possibilities. With just over $10 to her name, she had perhaps 2 weeks before destitution forced desperate measures. Surely in that time she could find some employment, even if it meant scrubbing floors or doing laundry. As twilight deepened into night, Eleanor unpacked her few belongings. From between carefully folded garments, she withdrew her most valuable possession, a small book of poetry, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside, pressed between the pages, lay a dried wildflower, a memento from her mother's grave, the only reminder of a woman who had also been deemed too fragile for this harsh world. "I will not follow your path, Mother," she whispered, her finger tracing the delicate preserved petals. "I will find a way to thrive here, no matter what Samuel Hollister or anyone else believes." Outside her window, Copper Creek settled into evening rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played a melancholy tune, the notes drifting on the cool night air. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, a reminder that beauty could be found even in desolate places. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this clean, spare room, she allowed herself one last evening of grief for the future that had vanished before it began. Dawn arrived with the persistent clanging of Widow Fletcher's brass bell. Eleanor startled awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling beams above her. Reality returned with cruel swiftness. The rejection, the boarding house, her dwindling funds. Closing her eyes against the growing light, she allowed herself exactly 3 deep breaths of self-pity before forcing her body upright. The small mirror above her washstand reflected a face she hardly recognized. Her journey had carved away what little softness she'd possessed, leaving sharp cheekbones and hollowed temples that lent her an almost feverish appearance. Eleanor splashed cold water on her face, pinched color into her pale cheeks, and twisted her hair into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Appearances mattered, especially now. She would not present herself to Copper Creek as a woman defeated. The boarding house dining room hummed with muted conversation when she entered. 5 women occupied the long oak table, their curious gazes flickering toward her before politely shifting away. Widow Fletcher stood at the head, ladling porridge from a steaming pot. Miss Hargrove, the older woman acknowledged with a nod. "You've met Hannah. These are my other boarders, Miss Abernathy, Mrs. Winters, Mrs. Tillman, and Miss Cook. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Eleanor nodded to each woman in turn, cataloguing details with the precision her circumstances demanded. Miss Abernathy, the schoolteacher, possessed the pinched expression of someone perpetually disappointed by her pupils. Mrs. Winters, the postmistress, was a robust woman with intelligent eyes that assessed Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Tillman, a plump widow with trembling hands, offered a sympathetic smile. Miss Cook, younger than the others and wearing a shop clerk's neat attire, merely glanced up before returning her attention to her porridge. "We keep a Christian table," Widow Fletcher announced, motioning Eleanor to an empty chair. "Heads bowed, if you please." The prayer was mercifully brief, the porridge surprisingly palatable, thick with oats and sweetened with dried apple pieces. Eleanor ate with careful restraint, though her stomach demanded more. A lady never appeared ravenous, her mother's voice reminded her. Even in desperate times, dignity remained her most valuable possession. "You'll be seeking employment, I expect," Mrs. Winters said as coffee was poured. Her directness cut through the carefully maintained silence. "Given your situation." Eleanor met the woman's gaze steadily. "Indeed. I wonder if you might direct me to establishments that could use an educated woman's skills?" A soft, collective intake of breath suggested she'd overplayed her hand. In a frontier town like Copper Creek, an educated woman might be viewed with suspicion rather than appreciation. "Depends what you mean by educated," Mrs. Winters replied, stirring sugar into her coffee. "If you're expecting to teach, you're out of luck. Miss Abernathy has held the school position for 15 years, and the town can't support another." Miss Abernathy nodded stiffly, as if Eleanor might attempt to wrest her position away that very morning. "I was an assistant teacher in Boston," Eleanor clarified, "but I'm willing to consider any respectable employment. Miller's General Store needs a clerk," offered Miss Cook unexpectedly. "Mr. Miller's daughter just married the blacksmith's son and moved to Denver." She looked down. Quickly, as if regretting her helpfulness, Mrs. Tillman patted Eleanor's hand. "The dressmaker might take on help, though she pays mostly in store credit. And Reverend Simmons was saying his wife needs assistance organizing the church library." "Unpaid, of course," Mrs. Winters added, with a meaningful look at Eleanor's threadbare cuffs. "Charitable work for spiritual enrichment." Spiritual enrichment wouldn't secure her next week's board, Eleanor thought, but didn't say. Instead, she smiled politely. "I appreciate the suggestions. I'll inquire at the general store first, I think." 20 minutes later, Eleanor stepped onto Copper Creek's main street, the morning sun illuminating what darkness had concealed the previous evening. The town was larger than she'd initially assumed. Perhaps 40 buildings arranged along the dusty thoroughfare, with smaller residential streets branching outward. Unlike many western settlements she'd glimpsed from the train, Copper Creek possessed a certain deliberate organization, its structures solid and purposeful rather than hastily erected. Miller's General Store occupied a prime corner location, its large windows displaying everything from cast-iron cookware to bolts of calico. A bell jingled as Eleanor entered, announcing her presence to the balding man arranging tinned goods on a high shelf. "Be with you in a moment," he called without turning. Eleanor took the opportunity to assess her surroundings. The store was immaculately organized, every surface dusted, every item precisely placed. Goods of obvious quality filled the shelves, not the cheap imitations one might expect in a remote location. Copper Creek, it seemed, possessed more prosperity than its modest exterior suggested. "Now then, what can I—" Mr. Miller turned, his welcoming expression faltering as he took in Eleanor's appearance. "Ah, you must be the Hollister bride." News of her rejection had clearly made the rounds. Eleanor forced herself to stand taller. "Eleanor Hargrove, sir. I understand you might be seeking a clerk." Miller's discomfort was palpable. "Well, yes, I was, but—" He busied himself straightening already perfect rows of canned peaches. "Thing is, Miss Hargrove, store work requires considerable stamina. Lifting, carrying, standing for hours." His eyes flickered to her slender wrists. "I'm not certain you're physically suited." It was the same assessment, delivered more gently than Samuel's, but identical in substance. Too fragile, too delicate, a liability rather than an asset. "I'm stronger than I appear, Mr. Miller," Eleanor said, striving to keep desperation from her voice. "And I have experience with accounts and inventory management." He shook his head regretfully. "I'm sure you're very capable, Miss Hargrove, but I can't risk it. Perhaps Mrs. Simmons at the church—" "Yes, the library," Eleanor finished for him, resignation settling like a weight. "Thank you for your time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The dressmaker's reception was equally discouraging. Mrs. Whitaker, a sharp-featured woman with pins clamped between her lips, scrutinized Eleanor with professional assessment. "Too thin to model the garments," she declared after removing the pins. "Customers want to envision how the dresses will look on proper women's figures. No offense meant," she added without sincerity. By midday, Eleanor had approached 7 businesses and received 7 rejections. Each cited different concerns: her apparent frailty, her Eastern refinement, her lack of frontier experience, but the underlying message remained consistent. Copper Creek had no place for a woman like her. Hunger gnawed at her as she trudged toward the church, her last prospect before admitting defeat. The white-clapboard building stood on a slight rise at the end of the main street, its modest steeple punctuating the sky like an afterthought. A small cemetery stretched behind it, markers tilting at odd angles as if the dead were restless beneath the hard-packed earth. The church door stood open, offering refuge from the strengthening sun. Eleanor stepped into the cool, dim interior, the scent of beeswax and aging hymnals enveloping her. She had taken only 3 steps toward the altar when a man's voice rang out. "I told you, heathens, no sleeping in the pews. This is God's house, not a flop house." A portly figure emerged from a side door, collar askew and spectacles flashing with indignation. Upon seeing Eleanor, the man pulled up short, his ruddy face flushing deeper. "Oh! Forgive me, miss. Thought you were one of the miners who sneak in for naps." He adjusted his clerical collar self-consciously. "Reverend Simmons, at your service." "Eleanor Hargrove," she replied with a slight curtsy. "I was told Mrs. Simmons might need assistance with the church library." His expression brightened. "Ah, yes, wonderful. Martha mentioned you might call. Come, Abigail will be delighted." He led her through the side door and down a narrow hallway to what appeared to be a converted storage room. Shelves lined the walls, each overburdened with books in various states of disrepair. Seated amid the literary chaos was a tiny woman with a pixie-like face and spectacles that magnified her eyes to owlish proportions. "Abigail, my dear, the new lady has come about the library position." Mrs. Simmons peered at Eleanor through her enormous lenses, her expression transitioning from confusion to comprehension. "Oh, yes, of course. Martha Prescott mentioned you. We're seeking occupation." She gestured to the surrounding disorder. "As you can see, we've received several generous donations from Eastern congregations, but I fear organization isn't my particular gift." The room contained perhaps 300 volumes. a respectable collection for a frontier church. Unlike the businesses that had rejected her, Mrs. Simmons seemed delighted rather than dismayed by Eleanor's appearance. "You look like a reader," the woman said approvingly. "Thoughtful eyes. Much better than brawny arms for this kind of work." For the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. "I'd be honored to help organize your library, Mrs. Simmons." The Reverend beamed. "Splendid. We can't offer much compensation, of course, just $2 monthly for 3 afternoons weekly. But," he added hastily, noting Eleanor's faltering expression, "there are certain additional benefits." Mrs. Simmons nodded vigorously. "Indeed. You'd be welcome at our table on your working days. We dine at 1 o'clock precisely. And of course, church members often share their bounty with us. Eggs, butter, occasionally meat when Mr. Buchanan is feeling generous." "Mr. Buchanan?" Eleanor inquired. "Elias Buchanan," Reverend Simmons clarified. "Our local butcher, quite prosperous and a generous contributor to church causes." He glanced at the small window through which the town's clock tower was visible. "In fact, if you'll excuse me, I'm expected at his shop shortly to discuss the upcoming harvest festival." After a few more minutes of conversation, during which Eleanor's duties were outlined and her hours established, she found herself walking back toward Widow Fletcher's with decidedly mixed emotions. The library position would provide some income. Not enough to cover her board, but something. The meals were a blessing, but still left her facing a significant shortfall. As she passed Miller's General Store again, her eye caught a small notice posted in the window. "Seamstress wanted," it read in careful script. "Apply at Buchanan Meats." Eleanor hesitated. A butcher shop requiring a seamstress seemed odd, but she could certainly sew. All Boston girls were taught the needle arts from childhood. With nothing to lose, she squared her shoulders and headed toward the shop the Reverend had mentioned. Buchanan Meats occupied a solid brick building near the town's eastern edge, set apart from other businesses by a small, well-tended lawn. Unlike the cloying sweetness that hung around the tannery or the general smokiness of the blacksmith's forge, the scent surrounding the butcher shop was surprisingly neutral, an indication of exceptional cleanliness in such an establishment. Small bell announced her entry into a shop unlike any butcher's she had seen in Boston. Gleaming glass cases displayed cuts of meat arranged with almost artistic precision. The wooden floors were scrubbed to a golden hue, and brass fixtures shone. With recent polishing, 2 women ahead of her were being served by a young man whose resemblance to the portrait hanging behind the counter, a stern-faced gentleman with impressive whiskers, marked him as a relation to the proprietor. "Mother says to remind you the roast for Sunday dinner must be at least £4, one woman was saying as the young man wrapped her purchase in brown paper. "Father's invited the new bank manager. £5 to be safe," the clerk suggested. "Father always says better too much than too little." As Eleanor waited, she couldn't help overhearing snippets of conversation that painted an intriguing picture of Elias Buchanan. Evidently a widower, particular about his merchandise, and prosperous enough that his opinion carried significant weight in town affairs. By the time the other customers had departed, her curiosity had considerably deepened. "May I help you, miss?" the young clerk asked, eyeing her thin frame with the now familiar assessment that suggested she was an unlikely customer for premium cuts. "I've come about the seamstress position," Eleanor replied, indicating the notice she'd seen. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, yes, Father mentioned he'd posted that. You'll want to speak with him directly." He gestured toward a door behind the counter. "Through there and up the stairs. First door on the right." As Eleanor climbed the surprisingly elegant staircase, she wondered what sort of man kept his business and home in such immaculate condition. The upper hallway was papered in a subtle green pattern, its burnished floors softened by a runner of good quality. Whatever she had expected of a frontier butcher's residence, this quiet elegance wasn't it. She knocked at the indicated door, straightening her collar and smoothing her skirts as she waited. Footsteps approached, heavy but measured, and then the door swung open to reveal the man from the portrait. Up close, Elias Buchanan was even more imposing. Tall and broad-shouldered, with that impressive salt-and-pepper beard framing a face weathered by sun and time, he seemed more suited to a banker's office than a butcher's shop. His piercing blue eyes looked straight through her, assessing and cataloguing with unsettling thoroughness. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features. "You," he said with quiet certainty, "must be Samuel Hollister's rejected bride. Rejected bride." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her lightheaded. In 3 days, she had hoped to outrun her humiliation, to become something other than the rejected bride in the eyes of Copper Creek. Yet here stood this imposing stranger, naming her shame with unsettling directness. "I am Eleanor Hargrove," she replied, chin lifting. "I've come about the seamstress position." Elias Buchanan studied her with disconcerting intensity, his eyes the precise blue of winter sky before snow. Unlike others who had assessed her frame with dismissal, his gaze seemed to look beyond physical dimensions to something deeper. "Come in, Miss Hargrove." He stepped aside, revealing a study furnished with unexpected sophistication. Leather-bound. Books lined one wall, while a substantial desk occupied the window alcove. Nothing about the space suggested its owner trafficked in carcasses and cuts of meat. "Please sit." She perched on the offered chair, spine straight as a fence post, hands folded primly to disguise their slight trembling. The man before her defied categorization. His clothes were of excellent quality but practical cut. His hands bore calluses, of honest labor, yet his speech carried educated cadences. Most disorienting of all, he looked at her without the pity or disappointment she had grown accustomed to. "You're wondering how I knew who you were," he said, settling into the chair opposite. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "The thought had occurred," Eleanor acknowledged dryly. His mouth twitched beneath the impressive beard. "Copper Creek sustained itself on 2 commodities, Miss Hargrove, silver ore and gossip. The former has diminished somewhat since the main. A vein played out, but the latter remains inexhaustible." Despite her unease, Eleanor found herself almost smiling. "I've noticed." "Samuel Hollister is a fool," Buchanan continued, the blunt assessment delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Though in this case, his foolishness might prove fortunate for others." She stiffened. "I don't require pity, Mr. Buchanan." "Pity?" His eyebrows rose. "Is that what you think this is?" He leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees, a curiously vulnerable posture for such a substantial man. "Miss Hargrove, I admire efficiency and despise waste. Samuel has wasted your time and his own. I intend to be more efficient." Eleanor's confusion must have shown on her face, for he continued without prompting. "I require someone with precise hands and a good eye. The seamstress position is legitimate, not some pretense for charity." He rose and moved to a cabinet, retrieving several folded cloths. When he spread them across the desk, Eleanor recognized them as butcher's aprons, but unlike any she had seen before. These were crafted of heavy canvas, expertly stitched with double seams and reinforced pockets. Small leather patches protected areas prone to wear. "My wife designed these," he explained, fingers tracing the stitching with reverence. "Superior to anything available commercially. Every butcher in 3 counties orders them. Since her passing, I've had difficulty finding someone who can maintain her standards." Eleanor examined the workmanship with professional appreciation. The stitches were indeed precise, the design thoughtful. "These are exceptional," she acknowledged. "Can you reproduce them?" "Direct. unadorned, the question hung between them. Eleanor considered the complexity, mentally estimating time and skill required. In Boston, she had supplemented her teaching income with dressmaking, simple garments for working women who couldn't afford shop prices. These aprons were straightforward by comparison, though the heavy canvas would challenge her slender hands. "Yes," she said with quiet confidence, "I can." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. $3 per completed apron. I supply materials. You may work here or take them to your lodgings, though I prefer the former for quality control. The sum was startling, far more than she had expected. A single apron would cover her weekly board at Widow Fletcher's, with 3 providing enough. Surplus to rebuild her depleted savings. Suspicion flared. Was this charity disguised as employment after all? "That seems generous," she said carefully. Buchanan's expression hardened slightly. "I pay for value received, Miss Hargrove. These aprons sell for $8 each. The materials cost approximately $1. $3 for skilled labor is entirely reasonable." The ice in his eyes thawed marginally. "My wife would not tolerate underpayment of women's work. Neither shall I." Eleanor's estimation of both the man and his late wife rose considerably. "In that case, Mr. Buchanan, I accept your terms." "Excellent." He extended his hand as he would to a male business associate. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor shook it, finding his grip firm but carefully modulated, strong without overwhelming her smaller hand. "When can you begin?" "I've secured a position at the church library 3 afternoons weekly," she explained. "My mornings and other afternoons remain open. Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, 9 until noon," he decided briskly. "I'll expect you tomorrow morning." He hesitated, then added, "There's a workroom adjoining this study. My wife's sewing machine remains in excellent condition. You're welcome to use it rather than hand-stitching everything." The tour that followed revealed a space that indeed seemed designed for precisely this purpose. A sunny room with large windows, a substantial cutting table, and a Singer sewing machine that Eleanor privately estimated cost more than all her worldly possessions combined. Shelves held neatly labeled containers of canvas, thread, and leather scraps. Everything spoke of order, purpose, and someone's loving attention. "Your wife must have been remarkable," Eleanor observed softly, running her fingers over the polished wood of the sewing cabinet. Something shifted in Buchanan's expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps, or a momentary relaxation of his formidable beard. "Catherine was extraordinary. We had 10 years together, not enough but more than many are granted." The simple tribute, delivered without sentimentality but with obvious feeling, touched Eleanor unexpectedly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Buchanan." He acknowledged this with a nod, then gestured toward the door. 9 o'clock tomorrow, Miss Hargrove. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot, too. Now back to the story. Eleanor floated, rather than walked back to Widow Fletcher's boarding house, her mind whirling with the sudden reversal of fortune. Employment, respectable, well-compensated employment, had materialized when she least expected it. The church. Library position would provide social connections and meals, while the seamstress work would furnish actual income. Neither position seemed influenced by her physical appearance, a refreshing change from the day's earlier rejections. The boarding house parlor was occupied when she returned, forcing Eleanor to navigate curious gazes and thinly veiled inquiries about her day's activities. Mrs. Winters seemed particularly determined to extract details, her questions circling with the precision of a hawk eyeing field mice. "I understand. You visited the church," the postmistress probed. "Reverend Simmons mentioned you'd be assisting with their little library." The slight emphasis suggested she found the term generous for the church's modest collection. Indeed, Eleanor confirmed, keeping her tone pleasant but uninformative. I've also secured a position as a seamstress. This announcement created the ripple of interest she had anticipated. Miss Cook looked up from her mending with obvious surprise, while Mrs. Tillman's eyebrows disappeared beneath her greying fringe. With Mrs. Whittaker? Mrs. Winters asked, confusion evident. But she told Agatha Miller this morning that you weren't suitable for her establishment. Not with Mrs. Whittaker, Eleanor replied, allowing herself the small satisfaction of a deliberate pause before adding, with Mr. Buchanan. The effect was electric. Miss Abernathy's teacup froze midway to her lips, while Miss Cook actually gasped. Most telling was Mrs. Winters' expression, a complicated mixture of disbelief, envy, and calculation that transformed her face into a tableau of conflicting emotions. Elias Buchanan, Mrs. Tillman clarified unnecessarily, as if there might be another Buchanan in Copper Creek whose name could provoke such reaction. The butcher? The very same, Eleanor confirmed, mystified by the intensity of their response. I'll be reproducing his late wife's apron designs. Catherine's aprons, Mrs. Winters murmured, her tone suggesting Eleanor had announced she would be handling crown jewels. Well, that single syllable contained volumes. Eleanor glanced between the women, sensing undercurrents she couldn't decipher. Is there something I should know about this position? Mrs. Tillman and Miss Abernathy exchanged meaningful looks. Miss Cook suddenly found her mending absolutely fascinating. Only Mrs. Winters seemed willing to elaborate, leaning forward with the air of someone conveying critical information. Elias Buchanan is the wealthiest man in Copper Creek, she explained in hushed tones. Owns not just the butcher shop, but the slaughterhouse outside town, 300 acres of prime grazing land, and shares in the silver mine. She paused for effect. He's also rejected every eligible widow and spinster from here to Denver. I don't see how that's relevant to my employment, Eleanor replied carefully. Mrs. Winters' smile held no warmth. His wife's workroom has been closed since her death 5 years ago. No one enters, not even Judith Miller, who cleans the rest of his home. And now he's offering it to you, a complete stranger. For business purposes, Eleanor clarified, increasingly uncomfortable with the woman's insinuations. Of course, Mrs. Winters agreed, in a tone suggesting she believed nothing of the sort. Just as he gave the church a new roof for business purposes and funded the school addition for business purposes, Elias Buchanan doesn't make decisions without careful calculation, Miss Hargrove. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Widow Fletcher appeared in the doorway, announcing dinner with the same bell that had heralded breakfast. The conversation fragmented as the women rose, though Eleanor caught several speculative glances, directed her way. During the meal, Hannah slipped into the chair beside her, eyes bright with curiosity. "Is it true you're working for Mr. Buchanan?" she whispered, as Widow Fletcher said grace. Eleanor nodded slightly, wary of encouraging further gossip. "He gave me a kitten once," Hannah confided after the prayer concluded. "Found it behind his shop and knew I'd always wanted one. He seems scary with that big beard, but he's not really." This simple assessment, untainted by adult complexities, comforted Eleanor more than she expected. "Thank you, Hannah. I think you're right." Later, alone in her small room, Eleanor unpacked the day's events like items from a valise, examining, each from multiple angles. Elias Buchanan remained an enigma, part frontier businessman, part cultured gentleman. The position he offered solved her immediate financial concerns, but clearly carried complications she hadn't anticipated. The women's reactions suggested she had stumbled into existing tensions within Copper Creek's social fabric. As darkness gathered outside her window, Eleanor found herself oddly unsettled by the memory of Buchanan's direct gaze. Unlike Samuel Hollister, who had seen only her physical inadequacies, the butcher had looked at her with an assessment that felt thorough, as if he were cataloguing qualities beyond the visible. "Ridiculous," she murmured to herself, splashing water on her face before preparing for bed. The man needed a seamstress. Nothing more. Mrs. Winter's insinuations were clearly born of small-town boredom and frustration. Yet, as she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor couldn't quite dismiss the strange intensity of Elias Buchanan's blue gaze, or the curious warmth that had bloomed in her chest when he'd called Samuel Hollister a fool. 9 o'clock found Eleanor standing before Buchanan Meats, watching dawn's mist retreat from the town's rooftops. She had risen early, determined to present herself as a woman of capability rather than desperation. Her grey dress, the best of her limited wardrobe, had been pressed with borrowed irons, her hair arranged in a simple but neat coil at the nape of her neck. The effect, reflected in her small hand mirror, was one of restrained competence, precisely the impression she hoped to convey. The shop was already open, early risers purchasing cuts for the day's meals. Eleanor slipped past the customers to the staircase at the rear, climbing to the upper floor with measured steps. The prospect of entering Elias Buchanan's private domain alone, without the excuse of an initial interview, suddenly seemed daunting. What exactly was the protocol for arriving at a widower's residence as an employee rather than a social caller? Her knock went unanswered. After a moment's hesitation, she tried the door, finding it unlocked. "Mr. Buchanan," she called, remaining carefully on the threshold. A distant voice responded from somewhere deeper in the residence. "In the kitchen, Miss Hargrove, second door on the left." Following his directions, Eleanor discovered a kitchen that, like the rest of the house, defied frontier expectations. Gleaming copper pots hung in ordered rows, while a substantial iron stove radiated welcome heat. The butcher himself stood at a large wooden table, shirt sleeves rolled to reveal powerful forearms dusted with dark hair. Before him lay cuts of meat arranged with surgical precision. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "You're punctual," he observed without looking up from his task. "Coffee's warm if you'd like some." He gestured toward a pot on the stove with the point of his knife. The casual offer created an unexpected dilemma. Accepting coffee seemed presumptuous for a first-day employee, yet declining might appear ungracious. Eleanor hesitated, prompting Buchanan to finally look up from his work. "Catherine always said thinking required proper fuel," he remarked, setting down his knife and moving to retrieve a cup from a nearby shelf. "You look like you're overthinking something as simple as coffee, Miss Hargrove. Allow me to simplify matters by insisting you have some." The cup he offered was fine china, its delicate pattern incongruous in his substantial hands. Eleanor accepted it with murmured thanks, surprised when he prepared it with a splash of cream before pouring the coffee. "You prefer it with cream. If I'm not mistaken," he said at her questioning look, "your expression when Widow Fletcher served black coffee yesterday morning suggested as much." Eleanor nearly spilled the hot liquid. "You were at the boarding house, delivering a standing order." His mouth curved slightly beneath the beard. "Widow Fletcher takes a side of beef monthly for her boarders. Yesterday was delivery day." The realization that he had noticed such a small detail about her preferences and remembered it was unsettling. Had he been observing her even then, evaluating her potential for this position? "Your workroom is prepared," he continued, apparently unaware of her discomfiture. "I've set out materials for your first project, a simple apron to assess your technique." He wiped his hands on a nearby cloth. I'll be in the shop until noon. If you require anything, Thomas, my son, can fetch me." With that, he returned to his mysterious meat preparation, the conversation clearly concluded. Eleanor retreated to the workroom, sipping the perfectly prepared coffee as she surveyed her new domain. In daylight, Catherine Buchanan's sewing room was even more impressive than it had appeared the previous day. Sunshine streamed through windows that faced east, illuminating a space designed by someone who understood the craft intimately. The cutting table stood at precisely the right height, the storage shelves within easy reach, the chair at the sewing machine positioned to capture the best light without casting shadows on detailed work. A stack of canvas pieces lay on the table, already cut to the pattern specifications, alongside spools of heavy-duty thread and leather patches. Eleanor ran, her fingers over the materials, appreciating their quality. Whatever his other qualities, Elias Buchanan clearly didn't compromise on his supplies. Setting aside the now empty coffee cup, Eleanor removed her shawl and hung it on a convenient hook. The room maintained a pleasant temperature, warmed by heat, rising from the shop below. After exploring the available tools and familiarizing herself with the Singer machine's particular mechanisms, she set to work with methodical focus. The canvas was substantial, but not impossible to manage, especially with the machine's assistance. Eleanor worked steadily, her fingers remembering skills honed during lean Boston winters when sewing had meant the difference between eating and going hungry. By mid-morning, she had completed the main assembly and was hand-stitching the leather. Reinforcements with careful precision, so absorbed was she in her task that the knock at the workroom door startled her into pricking her finger. A young man stood in the doorway, perhaps 17, with Buchanan's imposing height but leaner build and clean-shaven face. "Father asked me to check if you needed anything," he said, his gaze curious but not impertinent. "I'm Thomas." "Eleanor." "Hargrove," she replied, setting aside her work. "I'm quite well supplied, thank you." The boy nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, studying her with frank interest. "You're not what I expected." "Oh?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, finding his directness oddly refreshing after the veiled comments at the boarding house. "What did you expect?" "Someone older," Thomas admitted with youthful candor. "More like the other ladies who've tried to secure this position. They usually bring cakes or pies, wear their Sunday best, and ask about Father's favorite hymns." His expression suggested he found these tactics transparent and amusing. "You didn't do any of that." "I came about employment, not—" Eleanor trailed off, unwilling to voice the implications. "Courtship," Thomas finished for her. "Exactly. That's why Father hired you, I expect." A sudden smile transformed his serious face, revealing dimples that must have come from his mother. "The apron looks good. Better than the last attempt." Before Eleanor could inquire about this previous seamstress, heavy footsteps in the hallway announced Elias's approach. Thomas straightened immediately, his casual demeanor replaced by alert attentiveness. "Thomas, Mrs. Wilson is waiting for her order," Elias said, appearing behind his son. His eyes moved from the boy to Eleanor, then to the partially completed apron. Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. "I see you're making progress, Miss Hargrove. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Yes, sir," she replied, holding up the garment for his inspection. "I should complete it by noon, as requested." He crossed to examine her work, taking the apron with hands that seemed impossibly large against the stitching. His inspection was thorough, testing seams with gentle tugs and examining the precision of her top stitching with critical attention. Finally, he nodded. "Excellent work. The reinforcement placement is particularly good." He returned the apron, his expression thoughtful. "Catherine would approve." From Thomas's wide-eyed reaction, Eleanor gathered this was significant praise. Indeed, the boy excused himself to attend to Mrs. Wilson, leaving them alone in the sunlit workroom. "You mentioned a previous attempt," Eleanor ventured, resuming her seat at the sewing machine. "Was there another seamstress before me?" Something tightened in Buchanan's expression. "Several have tried. None maintained Catherine's standards." He ran his hand along the sewing table's edge, a gesture that seemed unconscious. "My wife believed function and beauty were not mutually exclusive, even in something as utilitarian as a butcher's apron." "A philosophy I share," Eleanor said quietly, returning to her stitching. "Though I imagine few appreciated such refinement. In an apron, Catherine understood details matter." Buchanan's voice held a warmth previously absent. The double stitching at stress points, the angle of pockets for easy access without catching on equipment, small refinements that elevated mere coverings to essential tools. His gaze settled on Eleanor's hands as they guided the fabric. "Hands reveal much about a person, Miss Hargrove. Yours work with intelligence." The unexpected compliment brought heat to Eleanor's cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. I'll leave you to your work," he said, moving toward the door. "Join us for dinner at noon if you're amenable. Nothing formal, just Thomas and myself." The invitation surprised her. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not kindness," he interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact. "It's efficiency. The meal is prepared. You require sustenance. Walking to the boarding house and back wastes valuable working time." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you find our company objectionable." Put that way, refusal seemed both impractical and impolite. "Not at all. Thank you for the invitation." When he had gone, Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elias Buchanan was unlike any man of her acquaintance, direct to the point of bluntness, yet capable of unexpected perception. His assessment of her hands as intelligent resonated in her mind, so different from the usual dismissals of her physical form. The dinner revealed yet another facet of the Buchanan household. The table was set simply but with evident care. Good. China, polished silver, a small vase containing freshly cut wildflowers. Thomas attended to his father with the easy coordination of long practice, while Elias carved the roast with professional precision. The meal itself was excellent, flavorful without being elaborate, portions generous without being overwhelming. Conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor had anticipated. Thomas proved to be an educated young man with ambitions beyond the butcher shop, though he spoke of his father's trade with obvious respect. "Harvard has an excellent medical program," he explained, responding to Eleanor's inquiry about his studies. "Father believes a butcher's understanding of anatomy provides advantageous preparation for surgical training. Precise cuts require precise knowledge." Elias agreed, passing Eleanor a dish of roasted vegetables. "Thomas has good hands for detailed work." "Unlike my brother," Thomas added with a grin. "James can barely stitch a wound, let alone perform delicate procedures." "Your brother is also in medicine?" Eleanor asked, trying to reconcile this with her understanding of the Buchanan household. "Army surgeon," Elias clarified. "Currently stationed at Fort Laramie. He lacks Thomas's patience but compensates with efficiency, different strengths for different aspects of the same profession." The conversation continued in this vein, thoughtful, intelligent, entirely free of the gossip and insinuation that had dominated dinner at Widow Fletcher's. By the time the simple dessert of baked apples was served, Eleanor found herself more relaxed than she had been since arriving in Copper Creek. "The apron is completed," she reported as they finished. "Would you like to inspect it before I begin?" "Another." "I trust your work," Elias replied, surprising her. "Complete 3 more by Saturday, maintaining the same standard, and we'll consider the trial period successful." "Thank you for your confidence, Mr. Buchanan." His expression softened. Fractionally, Elias, please, at least within these walls. Mr. Buchanan makes me feel like my father. Elias, she repeated, testing the name. It suited him somehow, solid and unpretentious like the man himself. The afternoon passed in productive silence. Eleanor completed the cutting for a second apron, her confidence growing as she worked in the well-designed space. By 4 o'clock, when she prepared to depart for her library duties, she had made significant progress on the next garment. Until tomorrow morning, Elias said, appearing at the workroom door as she gathered her shawl. Thomas will walk you to the church. That's not necessary, Eleanor protested. It's a short distance, and in broad daylight. Indulge me. His tone made it clear this was not a request. Catherine valued independence, but recognized practical considerations. Copper Creek's main street may be civilized, but the alleyways between here and the church are frequented by minors with more thirst than discretion. His concern seemed genuine rather than controlling, prompting Eleanor to acquiesce. As Thomas escorted her through town, she became aware of curious glances from passers-by. By tomorrow, she imagined, all of Copper Creek would know she had spent the day in Elias Buchanan's home. People will talk, she murmured, half to herself. Thomas snorted. People always talk. Father says gossip is the tax one pays for living. In a small community. He glanced at her, a hint of mischief in his expression. Though I admit, your presence in our household will provide them particularly rich material. Because of my situation? Eleanor asked. Because Father has allowed no one in Mother's workroom since her death, Thomas clarified. Until you. The significance of this admission settled over Eleanor like a heavy shawl. What had initially seemed merely a fortuitous employment opportunity now appeared more complex, laden with expectations and mysteries she couldn't begin to decipher. Why me? She asked quietly. Surely there are more qualified seamstresses in Copper Creek. Thomas's expression turned thoughtful. Father has his reasons. He doesn't make decisions lightly. At the church steps, he paused. For what it's worth, Miss Hargrove, I think you're exactly what he's been waiting for. Before she could ask what he meant, Thomas tipped his hat and departed, leaving Eleanor to wonder precisely what she had stepped into by accepting Elias Buchanan's proposition. The church library smelled of dust, leather, and faintly of the lemon oil Mrs. Simmons used on the shelves. After the pristine organization of Catherine Buchanan's workroom, the jumbled disarray of books felt almost overwhelming. Eleanor stood in the center of the small room, mentally cataloguing the challenge before her. Volumes of varying sizes had been stacked without apparent system, their spines displaying everything from theological treatises to popular novels donated by well-meaning parishioners. It's rather daunting, isn't it? Mrs. Simmons appeared in the doorway, her oversized spectacles magnifying her apologetic expression. I've meant to organize them properly for years, but somehow never found the right approach. Every library has its own logic, Eleanor replied, already pulling volumes from the nearest shelf. At Miss Weatherby's school in Boston, I reorganized their collection by subject and author. 3,000 volumes in all. You taught at a school. For young ladies. Mrs. Simmons looked impressed. How wonderful. We had assumed you were... She stopped abruptly, pink suffusing her cheeks. A desperate spinster seeking marriage at any cost, Eleanor supplied dryly. The weeks leading to her departure from Boston had taught her that direct acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths often disarmed further awkwardness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Simmons's blush deepened. I would never phrase it so indelicately. But you wouldn't dispute the assessment? Eleanor noted without rancor. She ran her finger along a book's leather spine, raising a line in the accumulated dust. I was An assistant teacher of literature and composition at Miss Weatherby's for 6 years, Mrs. Simmons, not a particularly prestigious position, but respectable enough. Then why? The older woman's confusion was evident. Eleanor considered how much to reveal. Her reasons for accepting Samuel Hollister's proposal, the school's financial difficulties, her impending termination, her aunt's declining health and mounting medical expenses, were deeply personal. Yet something in Mrs. Simmons's genuine confusion invited honesty. Circumstances changed, she said finally. The school was reducing staff. My aunt, my only family, passed away after a lengthy illness that consumed what savings we had. She straightened a row of hymnals with careful precision. Mr. Hollister's advertisement offered security, if not romance. It seemed practical. And now you find yourself stranded in Copper Creek. Mrs. Simmons' expression softened with genuine sympathy. Yet securing positions with both the church and Elias Buchanan within days of arrival. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Indeed he does, Eleanor agreed, though privately she attributed her employment more to desperation and determination than divine intervention. They worked together for the next hour, Eleanor establishing a preliminary organization system while Mrs. Simmons dusted and recorded titles in a ledger. The Reverend's wife proved to be an unexpectedly pleasant companion, curious without being intrusive, conversational without demanding responses. By the time the church bell tolled 5 o'clock, they had made visible progress in taming the literary chaos. "Will you join us for supper?" Mrs. Simmons invited, as they prepared to conclude the day's work. The Reverend always appreciates intelligent conversation. "Thank you, but I should return to the boarding house," Eleanor declined politely. Widow Fletcher has strict rules about meal times. As she gathered her shawl, Mrs. Simmons hesitated. At the doorway, "If I might offer a word of caution, Miss Hargrove," she said, her voice lowered though they were alone. "Elias Buchanan is a good man, one of the finest in Copper Creek, but his heart has been carefully guarded since Catherine's passing. Whatever your arrangement, remember that some wounds remain tender even after years." Before Eleanor could respond, the Reverend appeared, effectively ending the private conversation. His booming greeting echoed in the small library as he expressed delight at their progress. Eleanor made her farewells, Mrs. Simmons's warning echoing in her mind as she stepped into the late afternoon sunlight. Copper Creek's main street bustled with end-of-day activity. Miners trudged from the silver works at the town's edge, their faces streaked with dust and fatigue. Women hurried between shops, securing last-minute ingredients for evening meals. The saloon was already filling, tinny piano notes spilling into the street, alongside bursts of raucous laughter. "Miss Hargrove!" The familiar voice stopped Eleanor mid-stride. Thomas Buchanan emerged from the general store, parcels tucked under one arm. "Father sent me to escort you home, to the boarding house," he corrected himself quickly, color rising in his cheeks at the implication. "That's very thoughtful, but unnecessary," she demurred, conscious of curious glances from passers-by. "I'm perfectly capable of walking a few blocks, Father insists," Thomas replied, falling into step beside her regardless. "Besides, I'm heading that direction anyway. Mrs. Fletcher ordered coffee, and Miller's just received a shipment." They walked in companionable silence for several yards before Thomas spoke again. "Father was impressed with your work today," he offered. "He examined the completed apron after you left, said it was exemplary craftsmanship. The unexpected praise warmed Eleanor more than it should have. "Your father seems a man of exacting standards." "In everything," Thomas agreed, a hint of rueful affection in his tone. "James, my brother, says Father would measure the angels' wingspans if allowed into heaven." He shifted his parcels to his other arm. "Though in recent years he's grown more—" "I'm not sure." Reflective, perhaps. Grief changes people, Eleanor observed quietly. Thomas glanced at her with sudden sharpness. You speak from experience. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. My parents died when I was quite young. My aunt raised me. She passed last winter. I'm sorry, he said simply. After a moment, he added, Mother's death nearly destroyed him. For almost a year, he spoke only when necessary. He kept the business running. Father would never neglect his responsibilities, but the rest of him seemed absent. The vulnerability of this confession from a near stranger startled Eleanor. Why are you telling me this? Thomas's expression turned thoughtful. Because you should understand what it means that he's opened Mother's workroom to you. It's not just about aprons. Before she could press him for clarification, they arrived at Widow Fletcher's gate. The boarding house windows glowed with early evening lamplight, silhouettes of the other boarders visible through thin curtains. Thomas handed her the coffee parcel with a small bow. Until tomorrow, Miss Hargrove. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The boarding house parlor fell silent when Eleanor entered, conversations suspending mid-sentence. 5 pairs of eyes tracked her progress across the worn carpet, their collective scrutiny almost palpable. Mrs. Winters occupied the best chair by the fire, her knitting needles poised mid-stitch like weapons at ready. There you are, Widow Fletcher announced from the dining room doorway. Dinner in 10 minutes, just time to freshen up. Grateful for the reprieve, Eleanor retreated to her room, closing the door on the weight of unasked questions. She removed her shawl and washed her hands in the basin, the cool water soothing against skin pricked hot by the day's strange tensions. The face in her small mirror looked different somehow, less hollow with worry perhaps, or simply animated by purpose rather than fear. Dinner proved the inquisition she had anticipated. Mrs. Winters led the assault, her questions precise as, her knitting stitches. I understand you spent the entire day at the Buchanan residence, she began, as soup bowls were filled. Most unusual for a first day of employment. Is it? Eleanor replied mildly, breaking a piece of cornbread. I'm afraid I have limited experience with frontier employment customs. Mrs. Winters' eyes narrowed at this deliberate obtuseness. Mr. Buchanan is known for his particularity regarding his household. Few are invited past the shop. Then I'm fortunate he finds my sewing skills worthy of his standards, Eleanor replied, determinedly focusing on her soup. And you dined with them as well, Mrs. Tillman interjected, her tone suggesting Eleanor had been invited to a royal banquet. A simple meal shared with my employer and his son, Eleanor confirmed. Mr. Buchanan felt it more efficient than my returning to the boarding house midday. Efficient, Mrs. Winters repeated with poorly disguised disdain. Is that what he called it? Widow Fletcher cleared her throat pointedly. I'm sure Miss Hargrove appreciates steady employment regardless of Mr. Buchanan's motivations. The Lord provides in unexpected ways. The pointed mention of divine providence effectively suppressed further interrogation, though Eleanor felt Mrs. Winters' calculating gaze on her throughout the meal. The postmistress clearly suspected ulterior motives in Elias's hiring decision, a suspicion Eleanor might have shared, had Thomas not seemed so matter-of-fact about the arrangement. The boy's transparent nature suggested no hidden schemes, just a household functioning according to Elias Buchanan's precise requirements. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself to her room, citing fatigue. In truth, she wanted solitude to process. The day's revelations. Mrs. Simmons's cautionary words echoed in her thoughts, alongside Thomas's cryptic statement about his mother's workroom. What exactly had she stepped into? Was she merely a skilled worker meeting a business need? Or was there something more to Elias Buchanan's selection? Sleep proved elusive despite her physical tiredness. When the town clock struck midnight, Eleanor abandoned her restless bed and moved to the window. Copper Creek lay silent beneath a canopy of stars, its daytime bustle replaced by deep shadow and occasional lamplight. From her vantage point, she could just make out the solid brick structure of Buchanan Meats, its upper windows dark, save one, the study adjacent to Catherine's workroom, where a single light burned against the night. Was Elias awake too, haunted by memories or driven by his famous efficiency to continue working while others slept? The image of him sitting alone in his study, surrounded by books and ledgers while the town slumbered, tugged at something in Eleanor's chest. A recognition of solitude she understood too well. The next 3 days established a pattern of increasing comfort. Each morning, Eleanor arrived at the butcher shop precisely at 9, greeted by fresh coffee prepared to her preference. She worked steadily in Catherine's sunny room, the sewing machine's rhythmic purr becoming a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. Elias appeared periodically, ostensibly to check her progress, though these inspections inevitably expanded into conversations that ranged far beyond aprons and stitching on aprons. She learned he had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, bringing specialist knowledge of meat preservation that had proven invaluable to the growing mining community. He spoke of Catherine with quiet reverence, not the excessive sentimentality of fresh grief, but the measured appreciation of one who had integrated loss into the fabric of daily life. She believed beauty and utility were natural companions, he explained on the third morning, observing Eleanor's careful top-stitching. That practical things deserved the same attention to detail as decorative ones. A philosophy I share, Eleanor replied, guiding canvas beneath the machine's presser foot. My aunt taught me that well-made ordinary objects bring more daily joy than occasional luxuries. Something in Elias's expression shifted at this, a subtle softening around his eyes, perhaps, or a relaxation of his formidable beard. Catherine would have said exactly that. He watched her work for another moment before adding, "You have much in common with her." The comparison startled Eleanor, her fingers pausing mid-stitch. "I'm hardly a suitable comparison to your late wife, Mr. Buchanan, Elias," he corrected gently, "and the comparison isn't in appearance or circumstance, but in essence. The care with which you approach tasks, the precision of your observations, the unwillingness to compromise on quality, regardless of who might notice." These were not the superficial compliments Eleanor had occasionally received in Boston, empty praise of feminine charms or social graces. Instead, Elias had identified qualities she privately valued in herself, aspects of her character that Samuel Hollister had never bothered to discover before rejecting her. By Saturday, Eleanor had completed not just the requested 4 aprons, but a 5th as well, with improvements to the pocket design that even Elias acknowledged enhanced functionality. Their working relationship had settled into comfortable rhythms, punctuated by shared meals where conversation flowed with surprising ease. Thomas drifted in and out, sometimes joining their discussions, other times absorbed in medical texts that Elias procured from Denver booksellers. At the church library, Eleanor made similar progress, bringing order to literary chaos with methodical efficiency. Mrs. Simmons proved an unexpected ally, defending Eleanor from town gossip with cheerful deflection. "Miss Hargrove is exactly what both the church and Mr. Buchanan needed," she declared to anyone who questioned the arrangement. "The Lord's timing is perfect as always." But it was Widow Fletcher who delivered the most startling development as Eleanor prepared for bed Saturday night. "Mr. Buchanan came by this afternoon while you were at the church," the older woman announced, appearing at Eleanor's bedroom door. "Paid your board through the month and left this." She extended a small envelope. "Said to tell you he considers your trial period successfully completed. When Widow Fletcher had gone, Eleanor opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside lay not just payment for the week's work, $15, significantly more than the agreed amount, but a brief note in precise handwriting. Miss Hargrove, your work exceeds expectations. I propose extending our arrangement indefinitely with a salary of $18 weekly for daily morning work. Please advise if these terms are acceptable. With appreciation. E. Buchanan, P.S. Thomas mentioned you admired Catherine's botanical illustrations. The enclosed is one she particularly valued. Beneath the note lay a delicate drawing of a mountain wildflower, rendered with scientific accuracy, yet undeniable artistic grace. In the lower corner, elegant script identified it as Indian Paintbrush. Castilleja, Spring 1879. Eleanor traced the illustration's careful lines with her fingertip, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. $18 weekly, more than she had earned in a month of teaching at Miss Weatherby's. Financial security had arrived in the most unexpected form, offered by the most unexpected benefactor. Yet, as she prepared for sleep, a troubling question surfaced beneath her gratitude. Was Elias Buchanan truly impressed with her sewing skills, or was she somehow fulfilling a role in his grief? A convenient proxy for the wife whose workroom she now occupied. Sunday dawned clear and cool, the late summer air carrying the first whisper of autumn. Eleanor dressed with particular care, selecting her one good dress, navy blue with modest lace at collar and cuffs, for her first church attendance in Copper Creek. As a newcomer whose circumstances had already generated considerable gossip, she knew this public appearance would be scrutinized by the entire community. Widow Fletcher accompanied her boarders to services, their small procession moving with dignified purpose down the main street. Eleanor walked beside Hannah, grateful for the girl's cheerful chatter that distracted from her own nervous anticipation. Despite her practical nature, she couldn't help wondering if Elias would attend, and how he might acknowledge her outside their now established private routine. The church filled quickly, pews creaking beneath the weight of families in their Sunday best. Miners scrubbed pink and uncomfortable in stiff collars sat alongside shopkeepers and their wives. Children fidgeted despite maternal warnings, their whispers creating a gentle undercurrent beneath Reverend Simmons's pre-service preparations. "There's Mr. Buchanan," Hannah whispered, nodding toward the entrance. Eleanor resisted the urge to turn immediately, forcing herself to wait several seconds before glancing casually over her shoulder. Elias and Thomas stood in the doorway, both transformed by formal attire. Thomas looked handsome but boyish in his Sunday suit, his attempts at gravity undermined by youthful energy. Elias, however, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The difference was remarkable. His usual practical attire had been replaced by a well-tailored dark suit that emphasized his impressive build without ostentation. His beard appeared freshly trimmed, and his hair, usually covered by a practical hat, revealed distinguished touches of silver at the temples. He looked, Eleanor realized with a strange flutter beneath her ribs, exactly what he was, one of Copper Creek's most substantial citizens. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space. Elias acknowledged her with a slight nod, formal, respectful, revealing nothing of their daily interactions. The subtle gesture was noted by several observers, including Mrs. Winters, whose raised eyebrows communicated volumes of speculation. The Buchanans took their customary pew near the front, a position that, Eleanor later learned, had been Catherine's preference for optimal viewing of the altar flowers she had arranged weekly until her death. The congregation settled as Reverend Simmons ascended to the pulpit, his sermon books arranged with his wife's, in characteristic precision, "Beloved," he began, his ceremonial tone a sharp contrast to his everyday speech, "today we examine the Book of Ruth, a story of faith rewarded and loyalty blessed. The biblical tale unfolded in the Reverend's resonant voice, Ruth's devotion to Naomi, her humble gleaning in Boaz's fields, the kinsman redeemer's recognition of her worth beyond outward circumstances." Eleanor found herself unusually absorbed, the ancient narrative suddenly relevant to her own situation in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I have been told all you have done," Reverend Simmons quoted, his gaze sweeping the congregation. "How you left your father and mother and your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before." Boaz saw beyond Ruth's appearance as a foreign widow. He recognized quality of character beneath circumstances of hardship. Eleanor felt a prickling awareness, as if the words had been selected specifically for her. Across the church, Elias sat motionless, his profile visible from her angle, expression unreadable beneath his impressive beard. The service concluded with enthusiastic, if not entirely melodious, hymn singing. As the congregation dispersed into the churchyard for the customary post-worship socializing, Eleanor found herself simultaneously sought and avoided. Several women approached with calculated curiosity, barely disguised as welcome, while others, particularly those with unmarried daughters, maintained noticeable distance. "Miss Hargrove," Elias's voice behind her sent an unexpected warmth up her spine. She turned to find him standing with Thomas, both holding their hats respectfully. "Mr. Buchanan Thomas, good morning. Your first church service in Copper Creek," he observed. "I trust you found it illuminating." Was there a hint of humor in his tone? Eleanor couldn't be certain. "Reverend Simmons has a particular gift for making ancient texts feel relevant," she replied carefully. "Indeed." Something flickered in Elias's eyes. Awareness, perhaps, of the sermon's potential applications to their situation. "Thomas and I typically take Sunday dinner at home. We would be honored if you would join us." The invitation, delivered in such a public setting, created an immediate ripple of attention among nearby parishioners. Mrs. Winters, hovering within earshot, didn't bother disguising her avid interest. Eleanor hesitated, acutely aware of the social implications. Dining in Elias's home as an employee was one thing, accepting a Sunday dinner invitation was entirely another, yet refusing would create its own complications. "That's very kind," she began, mind racing for a graceful compromise. "Please say yes," Thomas interjected with youthful directness. "Father actually cooked this morning, which happens approximately once per century." This unexpected revelation, the dignified butcher preparing a meal himself, tipped the scales of Eleanor's indecision. "In that case, I would be delighted," she answered, unable to suppress a smile at Thomas's obvious satisfaction. "Excellent," Elias said, offering his arm with formal courtesy. "Shall we?" As Eleanor placed her hand on the offered arm, she caught Widow Fletcher's knowing gaze across the churchyard. The older woman gave an almost imperceptible nod that somehow conveyed both approval and caution. Behind her, Mrs. Winters' expression suggested she was mentally composing letters to share this development with correspondents throughout the territory. The walk to the Buchanan residence proceeded with proper public decorum, their conversation restricted to observations about the service and the pleasant weather. Only when they entered the private domain of Elias's home did a more natural atmosphere return. "I should inform you," Elias said as he hung their hats on the hallway rack, "that Thomas exaggerated my culinary efforts. I merely prepared the roast for cooking. Mrs. Parker, who assists with household matters, handled the actual preparation before departing for her own church obligations." "Father is being modest," Thomas countered, leading the way toward the dining room. He selected the specific roast and instructed Mrs. Parker on exactly how it should be prepared. The Buchanan Sunday roast is somewhat legendary in certain circles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The dining room, like the rest of the house, balanced masculine practicality with unexpected refinements. The table, large enough for 6 but set for 3, gleamed with polish, while silver serving pieces caught the midday light from tall windows. A centerpiece of late summer wildflowers added a touch Eleanor suspected was Thomas's contribution. Their casual arrangement lacking a woman's practiced eye. Catherine always gathered flowers for Sunday, Elias confirmed, noticing her attention to the centerpiece. Thomas maintains the tradition, though he lacks her artistic arrangement skills. I prioritize speed over aesthetics, Thomas admitted cheerfully. The good specimens are usually half a mile from the house, and I refuse to miss Father's roast for the sake of balanced flower composition. The meal lived up to its reputation. Beef cooked to perfect tenderness, vegetables from the Buchanan, a garden, freshly baked bread that filled the room with its yeasty aroma. Conversation flowed easily, ranging from town affairs to literature Thomas was studying, to Eleanor's progress with the church library. Mrs. Simmons mentioned you taught at a ladies' school in Boston, Thomas said as they finished the main course. What subjects did you teach? Literature and composition primarily, Eleanor replied, though I also assisted with mathematics when needed. Elias looked up with increased interest. Mathematics? That's unusual for a ladies' school. Miss Weatherby believed women's minds were equally capable of logical reasoning, Eleanor explained, though she presented it to parents as practical household accounting to avoid controversy. A diplomatic compromise, Elias noted with approval. Catherine maintained our business ledgers. Her organizational systems remain unsurpassed. As Thomas cleared the dishes for dessert, another clearly established tradition, Elias turned the conversation to business matters. I hope you found my proposed arrangement acceptable, he said, referring to the note delivered via Widow Fletcher. $18 weekly seems fair compensation for your skills. More than fair, Eleanor acknowledged, though I confess some confusion about the position's parameters. The apron orders surely don't require daily attention. Elias's expression turned thoughtful. I've been considering expanding the products offered. Catherine had designs for butchers, tool rolls, specialized carving aprons, even holiday presentation packaging that never reached production. He hesitated, then added, her illness came rather suddenly. The revelation hung between them, unexpectedly intimate. Eleanor sensed there was more to the story, some aspect of Catherine's death that remained particularly painful. I would be honored to help bring her designs to fruition, she said quietly. If you have her patterns and notes, I could certainly work from them. Something in Elias's face softened, a subtle relaxation around his eyes, a slight easing of his customary reserve. That would be most appreciated, Miss Hargrove. Eleanor, she corrected gently. If we're to work together on Catherine's designs, perhaps we might use our given names, at least within these walls. For a moment she feared she had overstepped. Then Elias smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his solemn features and crinkled the corners of his eyes. Eleanor, he repeated, as if testing the sound. Yes, I believe that would be appropriate. Thomas returned with apple tarts, still warm from the oven, their golden crusts dusted with cinnamon sugar. The boy's knowing glance between his father, and Eleanor suggested he had deliberately extended his absence to allow their private conversation. After dinner, Elias surprised Eleanor by inviting her to see the garden, while Thomas attended to homework. The small but meticulously maintained space behind the house revealed yet another dimension of the Buchanan household. Raised beds contained both practical vegetables and ornamental flowers, arranged with the same precision that characterized everything in Elias's domain. Catherine's design, he explained as they walked the narrow paths. She believed in beauty alongside utility, even in a kitchen garden. He paused beside a bed of late-blooming wildflowers. These were her particular favorites, the ones she collected for her illustrations. Eleanor recognized the Indian paintbrush from the drawing he had given her. She was remarkably talented. She found joy in close observation, Elias agreed, seeing details others overlooked. He bent to remove a stray weed with gentle precision. I've maintained her garden as best I can, though I lack her instinctive knowledge of growing things. It's beautiful, Eleanor said sincerely, a living tribute to her vision. They continued in companionable silence, the afternoon sun warming the garden's stone paths. Eventually, Elias spoke again, his tone more hesitant than she had yet heard. From him. I realize our arrangement may appear unusual to the townspeople, he said carefully. Your presence in Catherine's workroom, these Sunday meals. Copper Creek thrives on speculation. Mrs. Winters certainly seems to be forming theories, Eleanor acknowledged wryly. Does that concern you? His directness was refreshing after weeks of veiled insinuations from others. Eleanor considered the question honestly. I've never been particularly governed by others' opinions, she replied, though I'd prefer not to damage your standing in the community. Elias made a dismissive gesture. My standing is secured by economic necessity. Copper Creek needs its butcher more than it needs to approve of his private associations. He turned to face her directly. But you haven't answered my actual question. Does others' speculation concern you personally? The question's implications hung in the air between them. What exactly did people think was developing between the wealthy widower and the rejected mail-order bride? And was there any truth to their speculations? No, Eleanor said simply. It doesn't concern me. Something shifted in Elias's expression. A subtle relaxation, perhaps, or the easing of a private worry. Good. He offered his arm to continue their circuit of the garden. I find I value your presence in my household, Eleanor, more than I anticipated. The admission, delivered in his characteristically straightforward manner, warmed her more than the afternoon sun. I've found an unexpected peace here, she confessed. After the disappointment of my arrival in Copper Creek, I never imagined I would feel so settled so quickly. Samuel Hollister's rejection may prove the greatest stroke of fortune in your life, Elias observed, guiding her toward a small bench beneath a flowering crabapple tree. Though I recognize it didn't feel fortunate at the time, Eleanor laughed softly as they sat. Indeed not. Being deemed insubstantial is hardly flattering, regardless of the circumstances. Insubstantial, Elias repeated, genuine confusion in his tone. He rejected you for being too thin. Not in those exact words, Eleanor clarified, but essentially, yes. Apparently I don't appear sturdy enough for farm life. Elias's expression darkened beneath his impressive beard. Samuel Hollister, he declared with quiet force, is an even greater fool than I initially believed. Because you think I am sturdy enough? She asked, torn between amusement and curiosity at his vehemence. Because he evaluated you solely on physical appearance rather than character and capability, Elias replied. His gaze, direct and unwavering, held hers. You possess more substance than anyone I've encountered in Copper Creek, Eleanor Hargrove. Your physical dimensions are entirely irrelevant to your worth. The words, delivered without flattery or sentimentality, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Here was no empty compliment or strategic charm, but a simple statement of perceived truth from a man who valued precision above all else. Thank you, she said softly, finding more conventional responses inadequate. They sat in comfortable silence as afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden. Something had shifted between them, a mutual recognition that transcended their employer-employee relationship without yet defining what might take its place. "I should return to the boarding house," Eleanor said eventually, mindful of Widow Fletcher's expectations and the town's potential speculation. "Though I've enjoyed the afternoon immensely." Elias walked her to the front gate, maintaining proper distance now that they were potentially visible from the street. At the gate he hesitated, then spoke with deliberate care. "I hope you'll join us again next Sunday, as a matter of family tradition rather than employment." The invitation's significance was unmistakable, a public acknowledgement of her place in the Buchanan household beyond mere business arrangement. "I would be honored," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than her suddenly fluttering pulse. "Until tomorrow morning, then," he said, tipping his hat with formal correctness as she departed. Eleanor walked slowly back to Widow Fletcher's, her mind replaying the afternoon's conversations. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of Elias Buchanan, and perhaps in his perception of her. What had begun as a desperate grasp at employment now held possibilities she hadn't dared contemplate upon her humiliating arrival in Copper Creek. Samuel Hollister had rejected her for being too thin, seeing only physical inadequacy where Elias Buchanan had recognized something of far greater substance. The irony was not lost on Eleanor as she approached the boarding house, where Mrs. Winters would undoubtedly be waiting to extract every detail of her Sunday activities. For once, Eleanor found she didn't mind the prospect of the postmistress's interrogation. Let Mrs. Winters speculate, let Copper Creek gossip. The man who had seen her worth, not despite her slender form but regardless of it, was the only opinion that mattered now. The wealthy butcher had indeed seen her value, and Eleanor Hargrove, once rejected and abandoned, found herself standing, taller than she had in years, substantial in ways no scale could measure and no looking-glass reflect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.